Preston Vardell's fingers closed around Claire's wrist, the way they always did, not grabbing, not yanking, just settling there like a bracelet she never agreed to wear. His grip was practiced, surgical, tight enough to remind her who she belonged to, loose enough that no one at the charity gala would call it what it was. "We're leaving," he said. His voice was perfectly level. That was the worst part, not the anger, but the calm underneath it. The calm that meant he'd already decided what tonight would cost her. Claire felt the bruises under her foundation pulse, like a second heartbeat. She looked across the ballroom. 500 people in evening wear, crystal chandeliers, politicians shaking hands, and not one of them looking at her. Then she saw him, and something shifted inside her chest that she couldn't name yet. If you've ever been in a room full of people and felt completely alone, if you've ever smiled when you wanted to scream, then you already know exactly how Claire felt in that moment. Stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter, because what happens next is the kind of thing that changes a woman's entire life. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that ballroom. The charity gala had been Preston's idea, which meant Claire had no say in attending, no say in what she wore, and no say in how long they stayed. Those decisions had stopped being hers somewhere around month 4 of their relationship. So gradually, she hadn't even noticed the moment they disappeared. She'd noticed other things instead. The way he checked her phone every morning before she was fully awake. The way her friendships had dissolved one by one, not because he forbade them exactly, but because he'd make the aftermath of seeing anyone so exhausting that it stopped being worth it. The way he monitored her bank account and questioned every purchase over $20. The way an argument that started about her forgetting to confirm a dinner reservation could end with her on the bathroom floor, wondering how she'd gotten there. Tonight she wore a dress she hadn't chosen, heels that hurt, and a full face of carefully applied makeup that took 40 minutes and covered things she couldn't talk about in polite company. Preston stood beside her near the bar, holding a scotch he'd barely touched, wearing the expression she'd privately catalogued as his performance face, the warm, easy, slightly self-deprecating smile he deployed in rooms full of people whose opinions he needed. He was good at it. That was the thing people never believed when she tried to explain him. He was genuinely, remarkably good at being someone else in public. Senator Alcott just arrived. He murmured near her ear, and his tone carried the particular frequency she'd learned to read like weather. Not a statement, a directive. Stand up straight. Stop fidgeting. Be useful. Claire straightened. She watched Preston track Senator Alcott's movement through the room, the way a satellite dish tracks a signal. Preston had been courting Alcott's endorsement for 8 months. A development deal that would essentially double his net worth was sitting in legislative limbo, and Alcott's public support was the key that unlocked it. Tonight was supposed to be the night Preston closed it. He'd been talking about tonight for 3 weeks. He'd told Claire exactly what to wear, what to say if intruded, and with the specific patient tone he used when explaining things to someone slow, what not to say under any circumstances. She'd listened. She always listened now. It was easier. Preston excused himself and moved toward Alcott with the confidence of a man who'd never once doubted whether he belonged in a room. Claire watched him go and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of breathing room before she arranged her face back into the expression she wore at his events. Pleasant, warm present, but not loud. Decorative, without being distracting. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. The water was black and silver tonight. Somewhere out there, cargo ships moved through the dark. She found herself staring at them and thinking, not for the first time, about leaving. Not leaving the gala, leaving everything. Just walking out of this room and not stopping. She'd thought about it 3 times in 18 months. 3 actual attempts. The first time she'd gotten as far as her sister's apartment in Cambridge, before Preston arrived, not angry, not threatening, just disappointed, in a way that somehow felt worse than anything else, and explained patiently why she'd misunderstood the situation. She'd gone back. The second time she'd called a domestic violence hotline from a gas station bathroom. They'd been kind. They'd given her a plan. She'd started following it. Then she found out Preston knew someone in the department, and the officer she'd spoken to had connections she hadn't anticipated, and the conversation she'd thought was private turned out to be something Preston had been able to access. She still didn't fully understand how. She just knew that attempt had cost her more than the others. The third time had ended with 2 cracked ribs and a story about a fall that everyone who looked at her in the emergency room had either believed or chosen not to challenge. The protective order she'd filed from the hospital had vanished from the system in under a week. Preston had connections there too. That was when Claire stopped planning escapes and started surviving instead. She took a sip of her sparkling water and watched the harbor and tried not to think about any of it. Across the room, Preston's conversation with Senator Alcott was going visibly wrong. She could tell from the body language before she could hear anything. Alcott had that particular stillness of a man who'd made a decision and was waiting for an exit from a conversation. Preston had the too controlled posture of someone managing panic behind a composed face. They exchanged a few more words. Alcott's aide materialized at his elbow. Alcott smiled, offered his hand, and turned away, without the warmth that had been there when the conversation began. Preston stood alone for approximately 4 seconds. Then he turned and found her. His expression hadn't changed. That was the thing that made her stomach drop. He was still wearing the performance face, still smiling, still composed, but his eyes had shifted into something she knew how to read better than anything else in her life. He crossed the room toward her, and every step he took, her breathing got a little shallower. He stopped beside her, picked up a drink from a passing tray, brought it to his lips. "Smile," he said quietly. She smiled. "We'll leave in 10 minutes, he said. Same quiet voice. Same pleasant expression. "I need to say goodbye to the Harrington table first." "Okay," she said. 10 minutes. She'd been to enough of these nights to know what 10 minutes meant in the calendar of what came after. What happened in the car? What happened when they got home? Her ribs had healed 6 months ago, but she could still feel them sometimes. Preston moved toward the Harrington table, and she stood where he'd left her, and the harbor lights blurred a little in her vision, and she thought, "I cannot go home with him tonight." The thought arrived fully formed and certain, which was different from the previous 3 times. Those had felt like hope. This felt like something harder. Like the moment before you step off a ledge, and you don't know yet if there's ground or air below you, but you've decided it doesn't matter because the ledge has become unbearable. She set down her water glass. She looked around the ballroom. She needed something. She didn't know what yet. A person, a moment, a door, some variable that would change the math of the next 10 minutes into something survivable. That was when she saw Ronan Whitlock. She recognized him the way you recognize a weather system, not by the man himself exactly, but by the space around him. He stood near the far end of the bar, with 2 men positioned slightly behind him, and even in a room full of powerful people, something about him made the other powerful people orbit carefully. He wasn't performing. That was the first thing she noticed. Every other man in this room was performing something: confidence, accessibility, authority, warmth. Ronan Whitlock was simply standing there, and the performance was happening around him. He was older than most of the men she'd spoken to tonight. 40, maybe a little past it. Dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, dressed the way men shin dress when they don't need clothing to tell a room who they are. He held a glass of something dark and hadn't touched it in the 3 minutes she'd been watching him. She knew his name the way Bostonians who paid attention knew certain names. Ronan Whitlock moved through the city's legitimate business world, shipping, real electricians, and the rumors that moved with him were the kind people discussed carefully and quietly. His father had built something that operated in the spaces between what was legal and what was tolerated. Ronan had inherited it, and by most accounts expanded it considerably. Preston feared him. She'd seen it the one time they'd been in the same room 14 months ago. Preston had changed his route across the room to avoid a direct crossing of paths, and afterward he'd called Whitlock a thug with money and moved on quickly in the way people do when they're covering discomfort. Preston's fear of Ronan Whitlock was, in this moment, the most valuable piece of information Claire Holloway possessed. She pressed her hand against the base of her throat, just for a second, counted her breath. Then Preston appeared at her elbow. "Ready," he said. Not a question. "I need to use the restroom first," she said. A beat. The kind of pause that contained a calculation. She'd gotten better at reading those pauses. They were his version of a yellow light. The moment before the machines decided whether to stop or accelerate. Fine, he said. 2 minutes. She turned toward the restrooms. She walked at a normal pace. She turned a corner, and the moment she was out of his sightline, she stopped walking toward the restrooms and changed direction. She had no plan. She had approximately 90 seconds before Preston started watching for her. She had a room full of people who would not help her, and one man standing at the far end of the bar whose name made Preston rearrange his path across a room. She walked toward Ronan Whitlock. One of the 2 men flanking him saw her coming first. He shifted not aggressively, just repositioning. A subtle reorientation of weight that said, "I see you and I'm deciding." And Claire kept walking because if she slowed down, she would stop. And if she stopped, she was finished. The second man moved to intercept. She reached Ronan Whitlock before either of them could cut her off cleanly. She placed her hand against his chest. She felt him go still, the way a very large, very controlled person goes still when something unexpected happens, not flinching, not reacting, just pausing. The way a stopped clock looks calm. She looked up at him, and her heart was absolutely hammering, and she had no script for this, no planned words, just the knowledge of what was standing 20 feet behind her, and what waited at home and the absolute end of the road she'd reached. "Help me," she said. Then, because words weren't enough, and she needed something he couldn't ignore, and Preston needed to see something that would stop him cold, she rose up on her heels and kissed him. It wasn't the kiss of a woman in control of the situation. It was too desperate for that, a little clumsy. The kind of thing that comes from someone running out of options, rather than someone executing a plan. His mouth was warm, and he didn't move for a half-second that felt very long, the stillness of a man recalibrating, and then she felt his arm come around her waist, and he kissed her back. She heard the room shift. Not loudly. Boston money doesn't make noise at its own shock. But she felt it, the slight frequency change of 100 conversations that paused and restarted. And then she heard Preston's voice, closer than she expected, already moving Claire. She felt Ronan's hand settle at the small of her back. Firm. Not possessive the way Preston's grip was possessive. Something different. Territorial, but the kind that faced outward, away from her, like a wall between her and whatever was approaching. Preston stopped. She could hear him stop. Ronan ended the kiss. He looked at her not the way men look at women they've just kissed, with heat or calculation or satisfaction, but the way someone looks when they're trying to read a map quickly in bad light, trying to understand the territory. He didn't speak to her yet. He turned his head just slightly, like a man who's heard something behind him and doesn't need to look directly to know what's there. "Mr. Vardell," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Unhurried. A silence. "She's had too much to drink," Preston said. Claire recognized the tone, the long-suffering, gently burdened tone of a man managing a difficult woman for the benefit of an audience. "She's not well. I need to take her home." Ronan looked at her. Not at Preston, at her. "Do you want to go with him?" The question landed in the middle of the room, and everything else went quiet in Claire's head. The fear, the planning, the calculation, and what remained was something very simple and very enormous. Someone was asking her what she wanted. She couldn't remember the last time that had happened. "No," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "No," she said again. "He hurts me." She hadn't planned to say it. Hadn't scripted it. It came out of some place that had been sealed for so long that when it opened, the words arrived before she could stop them. She felt her throat tighten after. The way your body betrays you after you've done something irreversible. Preston's composure shifted. She didn't look at him, but she felt it the way a room feels when a particular kind of pressure changes. "That's not," he started. "Don't." Ronan's voice was still quiet, still unhurried, but something in the quality of it changed in a way that was hard to describe, precisely the way you can't see a current in deep water, but you can sense the pull. He looked at her wrist. The wrist Preston had grabbed in the moment, before she'd broken away. The sleeve of the gown had shifted, and the bruising there was not subtle. 3 days old and still yellow-purple, and shaped unmistakably like fingers. Ronan looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked at Preston. "Walk away," he said, "right now, and understand what I'm telling you." Whatever Ronan Whitlock said in rooms full of people, it apparently carried a particular quality of instruction, because Preston said nothing. Claire heard him breathe. She heard the slight scrape of his shoe on the floor. Then she heard him leave. The room exhaled around her. She became aware of how much she was shaking. Only after Preston was gone, the kind of shaking that isn't visible, just a vibration in the bones, the body's invoice for what the mind just spent. Ronan's hand was still at her back. Not pressing, just there. "Look at me," he said quietly. She looked at him. This close, the rumors felt both more and less credible. There was nothing theatrical about him. Nothing performing danger or performing anything. He just looked like a man who had made a lot of decisions and was in the process of making another one. "Are you hurt right now?" he asked. "Tonight. Before this." "No," she said, "not tonight. The bruise on your wrist. 3 days ago." He nodded, absorbed it. "Do you have somewhere safe to go tonight, family?" "A friend." She thought about her sister in Cambridge and how Preston had found her there in under 4 hours, and she shook her head. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the gala had resumed its customary performance of itself. Conversations restarted, music reoriented, waitstaff moved through the crowd. A sound. Whatever had just happened had been witnessed and filed away by everyone present, and most of them were already constructing the version of the story they'd tell tomorrow. "My car is outside," Ronan said. "My people will bring it around. You can decide between now and when we reach the door whether you want to get in or whether you want me to arrange somewhere else for you. But you're not going back to him tonight." It wasn't a question, but it also wasn't the same kind of statement Preston made. Preston's certainties were cages. This felt like something else. A door that happened to be pointing in a useful direction. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know me." He considered that for a second, like he was taking it seriously. "I knew his father," he said. "Before Preston was born, probably. Decent man. Died decently." He paused. "That thing on your wrist isn't an accident." She looked down at the bruises and pulled her sleeve down. "How do I know you're not worse?" she asked. It surprised her that she said it. It surprised him too. She thought a slight recalibration behind his eyes. "You don't," he said. "That's a fair question, and there's no good answer to it right now." He moved slightly, positioning himself so they were talking with their backs to the room, giving her what felt like privacy. "I can tell you that I've never hurt a woman in my life. I can tell you my people will give you a room with a door that locks from the inside, and I'll be on the other side of the penthouse. I can tell you you'll be able to leave whenever you want." He paused. "Or I can call you a car right now, give you a number for a private security firm I trust, and pay for a hotel tonight under a name Preston can't trace. That's also on the table." She stood there. The harbor lights were visible through the windows across the room. Black water and moving boats. "Does Preston know people at hotels?" she asked. Something shifted in Ronan's expression. Not amusement exactly, recognition. "Probably," he said. "He's thorough." "Then the penthouse," she said. She said it before she could think longer about it, because she'd learned that thinking longer in these situations was just another name for talking yourself back into the trap. She'd done it 3 times already. She was 30 seconds away from doing it a 4th. "Okay," Ronan said simply. He said something quiet to the man on his right. The man moved away. Ronan turned back toward her, and his expression was, as far as she could tell, exactly like what it had been. Neither warm nor cold, just present and deliberate. "I'll need you to stay close to Marcus and Dev," he said. "Not because you're in danger right this second, but because Preston isn't predictable tonight, and I'd rather not discover what he decides to do in a parking garage." She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the particular absurdity of receiving sensible security advice from a mafia boss while standing in the wreckage of the most desperate thing she'd ever done had a quality to it that her body didn't know how to process. "Okay," she said. They left the gala with her, between his 2 men and Ronan, 1/2 step behind her, and as they moved toward the exit, she kept waiting for the familiar, feeling the sense of being steered, redirected, managed. It didn't come. He didn't touch her unless she stumbled in the heels on the steps outside, and his hand appeared briefly under her elbow and then disappeared again. In the car, she sat by the window and watched the city and tried to inventory what she'd done. She'd kissed a stranger at a charity gala in front of 500 people. She'd publicly accused Preston Vardell of hurting her. She'd left in Ronan Whitlock's car. By morning, the shape of this night would be in every relevant conversation in Boston's social and political circles. There was no one doing it. Preston would know there was no quiet resolution available now. Whatever he did next, he would do in the full knowledge that she was under the protection of someone he was afraid of. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The pregnancy test she'd taken 3 weeks ago had been negative. That was the other thing she'd been carrying. The terror that had existed separately, the other terror, that she'd managed to set aside only because one crisis at a time was the only math that worked. She'd left that behind too, apparently, along with everything else she owned. She had the dress, the shoes, the phone that Preston paid the bill for and could therefore access whenever he chose. She looked at the phone in her hand and then looked at Ronan. "He tracks my phone," she said. Ronan turned his head and looked at her phone, then at the man in the front passenger seat. "Dev," he said. The man reached back without turning around. A new phone appeared in his hand. "Leave yours in the car," Ronan said. "My people will deal with it." She set Preston's phone on the seat beside her and picked up the other one. It was a basic model, nothing on it yet. "Thank you," she said. He turned back toward the window. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't seen the penthouse." Outside, Boston moved past them in the dark streetlights and storefronts, and the waterfront opening up ahead, the harbor wide and cold, and going somewhere beyond what she could see from where she sat. She held the new phone in both hands and didn't say anything else. She was still shaking in her bones. But Preston's fingers weren't on her wrist, and for tonight, that was enough to keep moving on. The penthouse was on the 14th floor of a building that faced the harbor, and the elevator required a keycard that only 3 people apparently possessed. Claire learned this because the man named Dev explained it to her in the lobby, not with the performative patience of someone managing a difficult situation, but with the flat efficiency of someone communicating useful facts. She filed it away. She'd spent 2 years learning to file things away. The space itself was large, without being theatrical about it. No marble fountains, no ostentatious display of what money could do when it had run out of practical things to buy. The furniture was heavy and dark, and looked like it had been chosen by someone who actually sat in furniture rather than someone decorating a photograph. There were books on a built-in shelf along the east wall, not decorative books arranged by spine color, actual books with broken spines and paper slips marking pages. A kitchen that looked used. A dining table with 4 chairs and a 5th pushed slightly back from the others, the way a chair looks when someone has a habit of sitting in one spot. Wade Merrick, Ronan's head of security, was already there when they arrived. He was a broad, economical man in his early 50s, with a face that had absorbed a lot of weather over the years, and arrived at something that was neither warm nor cold, but simply functional. He looked at Claire the way a person looks at a situation they are already categorizing, not unkindly, but without sentiment. "Guest room is made up," he told Ronan. Then to Claire, lock works from the inside. Deadbolt and a chain. The window's 12 stories up and faces the water, so that's your call. He paused. There's a phone on the nightstand. Dials the front desk, dials Dev, dials me. Doesn't dial out to a public line without routing through our system, which means it can't be traced back. "You do this often?" Claire asked. "No," Wade said. And the simplicity of it was somehow more reassuring than a longer answer would have been. Ronan was in the kitchen. She could hear him moving. Not performing domesticity, just doing something with his hands, the way people do when they need a moment to let a complicated evening settle. "You should eat," he said from the kitchen. "There's food. I'm making eggs because it's the only thing I'm competent at after midnight, and you look like you haven't had anything since this afternoon." She almost said she wasn't hungry. She caught herself. "Okay," she said instead. She sat at the kitchen counter and watched him cook, and it was the strangest thing, this man whose name made other men rearrange their routes across rooms, cracking eggs into a pan like someone's tired father on a Sunday morning, not performing normalcy but actually inside it, at least for this one moment. She ate. The eggs were plain, not particularly seasoned, but she was hungrier than she'd admitted, and she cleaned the plate. He watched her eat without commentary, which was its own kind of relief. "Preston will be making calls tonight," he said when she set down the fork. "I know. He'll try to find out where you are. He'll try to find leverage." He paused. "He'll probably succeed at finding out where you are. I'm not going to lie to you about that. People talk. Enough people saw you leave with me that by morning, it's established. So what does that mean? It means his problem's complicated. Knowing where you are and being able to do anything about it are different problems." He set his own plate aside. "He's not going to knock on that door. Not mine. He knows people," she said. Inside the city, lawyers, cops. A judge, I think, based on the protective order. Ronan didn't react to that the way she expected, with surprise or outrage, or the particular discomfort of someone encountering a thing they'd prefer not to look at directly. He just nodded, like she'd confirmed a calculation he'd already made. "I know who he knows," Ronan said. She looked at him. "How?" she asked. "Boston isn't as large as it believes it is," he said. It wasn't an answer exactly, but she had the distinct impression she'd get more of the truth later than she'd get right now. And that was probably the right sequencing for midnight in a stranger's kitchen. He told her to get some sleep. She went to the guest room. She turned the dead bolt, put on the chain. She sat on the edge of the bed in the borrowed evening gown. She didn't have anything else to wear and looked at the locked door for a while, waiting for something to feel wrong. Nothing felt wrong. That was almost more disorienting than the fear would have been. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing and was asleep in under 4 minutes. She didn't hear anything until morning. The morning arrived with light off the harbor coming through curtains that were good quality, but not black out the kind of curtains in a room designed for someone who might need to know what time it was without reaching for a clock. Claire lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and took inventory of herself the way she'd learned to do. Physical first, then everything else. No new damage. Ribs intact. The bruise on her wrist was the same purple-yellow it had been yesterday. The makeup she'd slept in had transferred to the pillowcase, and she felt the stripped, slightly raw sensation of foundation that had been on skin for too many hours. She was in a Mafia boss's penthouse, in a borrowed evening gown, with nothing to her name except a new phone with no contacts in it. She was also, she realized, not afraid. Not the absence of fear, exactly, more like the fear had relocated. It was still there. It had just pointed itself at a different horizon than the one she'd been watching for 2 years. Preston's specific brand of dread, the constant low-frequency anticipation of what he might do in the next hour, the next room, the next sentence that was gone. Replaced by the more general anxiety of a person who has jumped and doesn't know yet what they've jumped into. She got up, washed her face, found a folded stack of clothes on the dresser that hadn't been there last night, a plain long-sleeved shirt, sweatpants, socks, all clearly not chosen for style, but for approximate fit and basic dignity. No note she put them on. They were too large in the shoulders, and the sweatpants required rolling at the ankle, but they were clean and comfortable, and she stood in front of the small mirror above the dresser and looked at herself without the armor of the makeup and the gown and the performance, and tried to recognize what was there. She looked tired. She looked for the first time in a while like herself. She went out. Wade was at the kitchen table with coffee and a phone and a tablet, all of which he was managing with the focused economy of someone who'd been awake for several hours already. He looked up when she came in and set the tablet down without comment. "Coffee," he said. "Not a question, please." He poured it and slid it across the table and returned to whatever he'd been reading. She sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the windows at the harbor. "Where's Ronan?" she asked. "Out," Wade said. She waited. "He had a 6 a.m. meeting," Wade said. "He has those most days. His schedule doesn't accommodate disruptions, including the ones he causes himself." There was something in the way he said it that wasn't quite criticism, wasn't quite loyalty either. Something in the middle, the particular register of a man who has been with someone long enough to know their shape exactly, including the parts that aren't easy. "He told you to be here," she said. "I'm always here," Wade said. "That's what head of security means." She drank her coffee. It was good coffee, not fussy, just good. Whoever made it had made it correctly and recently. "He made eggs last night," she said, mostly to herself. Wade made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been general acknowledgement. "He does that," he said, "when he doesn't know what else to do with a situation." She looked at him. "Does he do this often?" she asked. Not the same question she'd asked last night. More specific now. Wade put down the tablet. "No," he said. And again, the same flat simplicity that wasn't designed to comfort her, but ended up doing exactly that. Preston's first contact came at 9:47 in the morning. Not to her, she had no phone he could reach. To Ronan. She only knew because she was still at the kitchen table when Ronan came back, and Wade showed him something on the tablet, and the temperature in the room changed the way it changes when two people who know each other well are having a conversation. In the compressed language of people who don't need to speak out loud. Ronan read whatever was on the tablet, set it down, poured himself coffee, and drank half of it, standing at the counter. He's hired an attorney, Ronan said. Not to her specifically, to the room. 3 attorneys, Wade said, the firm on Newberry. Also contacted a private investigator Galloway's office, which means he's looking for something to use rather than something to prove. Claire set down her mug. What kind of something? Ronan looked at her. The kind that muddies water, makes it harder to establish a clean narrative. He paused. He'll try to find anyone you've had contact with, anything you've said, anywhere you've been, that can be reframed. He's done this before. He's done this to other women, she asked. A silence. There was someone before you, Ronan said. 3 years ago, she left. He retained attorneys and investigators. She eventually signed an agreement and moved to Atlanta. He said it evenly, without editorializing, which made it worse somehow. More real. I didn't know the details until 6A.
Today,
Claire sat with that 3 years ago, another woman. An agreement and a city change and, presumably, a silence that followed her there. He's going to say I'm lying, she said. Yes. He's going to say last night was a breakdown, that I'm unstable, that I kissed you a criminal because I was drunk or confused, or… Yes, Ronan said again. And people will believe him. He looked at her steadily. Some will. She appreciated that he didn't argue it. She'd spent 2 years being told things would be fine by people who wanted to believe that, and it had left her with very little patience for comfortable lies. So what do we do, she asked. You don't do anything yet, he said. You let me do some things. That's not… She stopped herself. I'm not going to sit here and be a problem you're managing. I know, he said, and something in his expression shifted just slightly, not softening exactly, but recalibrating, like he'd seen something he hadn't expected. I didn't say managed. I said give me today. He put his coffee mug in the sink. I know people who know how Preston built what he built. His financial relationships. His political ones. His legal ones. The thing about men like Preston is they don't actually build loyalty. They build obligation. An obligation has seams. You're going to pull on the seams, she said. I'm going to find them first, he said. Then we'll talk about what to pull. He left again. She sat at the table with Wade, who returned to his tablet as though the conversation had been filed and processed and was now complete. She stared at the harbor. A container ship was moving slowly through the outer channel, enormous and unhurried. He's not what I expected, she said. Wade didn't look up. People mostly aren't. Is he dangerous? She asked. Wade put the tablet down this time. He looked at her directly, with the particular attention of some deciding how honest to be. Yes, he said, but not the way Preston is. He picked the tablet back up. Preston is dangerous, the way a cornered animal is dangerous. Small space, no options, survival instinct. Ronan is dangerous the way a current is dangerous. You don't see it from the surface. She let that sit. Why is that supposed to make me feel better? She asked. It's not supposed to make you feel anything, Wade said. You asked a question, I answered it. She almost smiled. The afternoon arrived with her wearing borrowed sweatpants and no plan and the acute realization that she had no clothes, no identification, no bank account. Preston couldn't access, no workspace, no tools, no contacts she trusted, and a graphic design business she'd been trying to build for 8 months that lived primarily on a laptop she'd left at Preston's apartment. The laptop that was password protected, but that Preston knew how to get into because he'd watched her type the password once and never mentioned it, and she'd only figured out that he knew it the 3rd time she came home to find her files subtly rearranged. She asked Wade about getting her things. He shook his head slowly. Not yet. My work is on that laptop, she said. We can replace the hardware. The files are probably cloud-backed. Some of them. Which ones aren't? She thought about it. There were 3 active client projects in local folders. She hadn't pushed to the cloud because she'd been worried about storage and had been meaning to upgrade her plan. A branding project for a restaurant group that was due in 11 days. A logo package for a small nonprofit. A half-finished pitch deck for a tech startup run by a woman she'd actually liked. One of the few client relationships that felt like the beginning of something real. The restaurant project mostly, she said. And a pitch deck. Tell me what you need to reconstruct them. We'll get you equipment today. She opened her mouth to say something about how this wasn't his problem, and stopped herself. She'd been about to perform the ritual of minimizing her own needs for the comfort of someone nearby, and she recognized it for what it was, habit that Preston had installed so thoroughly she'd stopped noticing she was running it. A laptop, she said. The software suite. And access to my cloud storage without going through the email address Preston has access to. Wade was already typing something. By 4 in the afternoon, a laptop was sitting on the dining table with her design software installed and a new email address and a recovered partition of her cloud storage that a young man Wade had called, whose name was apparently Theo and who seemed to operate in the gong technical spaces between what was ethical and what was useful, had managed to separate from Preston's access in under 2 hours. She sat down at the table and opened her files and stared at the branding project she hadn't touched in 9 days. She started working. She didn't stop until Ronan came back at 7 that evening, at which point she was deep enough into a typeface comparison that she heard him come in and noted it and kept working for another 8 minutes before she surfaced. He stood in the kitchen doorway, jacket off, looking at her the way people look at something unexpected. "You've been working," he said. "Apparently." "Wade said you ate lunch." "A sandwich," she said. "He's very insistent." "He likes things to be handled," Ronan said. "People not eating bothers him." She saved her file. Stretched. Her neck ached from the unfamiliar chair, and the hours hunched over a screen, and it was the best kind of ache, the kind that came from making something rather than surviving something. "What happened today?" she asked. Ronan sat down across the table. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the other kind. The kind that comes from moving pieces around a board that keeps getting more complicated. "I spoke to 3 people," he said. Preston's primary investor in the development deal, a man named Farrow, received some documentation this afternoon. Financial records and correspondence relating to how Preston managed a previous development partnership 6 years ago. He paused. Farrow is fastidious about his reputation. The documentation concerned him considerably. "What kind of documentation?" Claire asked. "The kind that suggests Preston has a pattern of presenting partners with one version of an arrangement and executing a different one." He said it carefully, not confessing to anything, but not pretending either. Farrow will not be withdrawing publicly. He'll simply become unavailable. And the senator? Alcott? Alcott already knew things about Preston that he'd chosen to overlook because the development deal was valuable to his district. Once the deal begins to look unstable, the calculus changes. Ronan folded his hands on the table. "I didn't manufacture anything. I want to be clear about that. I surfaced things that exist." She looked at him. "Why does it matter to you that I know that?" she asked. He seemed to think about it. "Because you came to me in a room full of people, because you needed to trust someone in a hurry," he said. "And I'd like that to have been a reasonable decision." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She'd expected something more strategic, something that positioned him well. "It might not have been reasonable," she said. "Probably wasn't," he said. "But here we are." She almost smiled. The threat arrived on the 4th day, not to Ronan directly, not in a way he could act on immediately. It came in the form of a courier envelope delivered to the building's front desk, addressed to Claire Holloway in Preston's handwriting, containing a single folded sheet of paper with a printed message and no signature. She read it. Her hands didn't shake this time. The message told her that the protective order she'd attempted to file had not in fact disappeared, it had been preserved. That Preston possessed a copy, that the copy contained irregularities in how she'd described certain inconsistencies he would be prepared to use in any legal proceeding she attempted, that he had witnesses who would characterize her behavior over the previous 18 months as erratic, manipulative, and potentially dishonest, that she could return home quietly and they could resolve this privately, or she could continue down the current path, and he would make the resolution considerably more painful. At the bottom, handwritten, "You know I always finish what I start." She folded the paper, put it on the table, walked to the window and stood there looking at the harbor, with her arms crossed across her chest until she could breathe normally. Then she took the paper and went to find Wade. Wade read it, called Ronan. Within 20 minutes, all 3 of them were at the table, and the paper was in the center of it, and the dynamic in the room was very different from the kitchen conversation about eggs 4 days ago. "He has the order," Ronan said. "He wasn't asking." "He always did," Claire said. "I think he had it pulled and copied before they removed it from the system, so he'd have something to use later." Her voice was steady. She was slightly amazed by that. That's how he operates. He builds insurance for things he hasn't decided to do yet. The inconsistencies he's referencing, Wade said. Do they exist? I was in a hospital the night I filed it, she said. With 2 cracked ribs. I was on pain medication and I hadn't slept in 30 hours. Yes, there are probably inconsistencies. Wade looked at Ronan. We need an attorney, Ronan said. We need the right attorney, Wade said. I know one, Ronan said. He said it the way he said most things, without elaborating on how he came to know things, in the way of a man who'd spent years in rooms that didn't get documented. Claire looked at the paper on the table. He thinks this will scare me back, she said. Neither man said anything. It's not going to, she said. Claire Wade started. I'm not being brave, she said. I'm being clear. If I go back, this, she gestured at the paper, doesn't go away. He keeps it. He uses it whenever I think about leaving again. He'll use it for the next 10 years. She pressed her fingertip to the table. If I stay out here and fight it, at least the fight is real. Ronan looked at her for a moment. Then, okay, she repeated. Okay, we fight it, he said. The attorney's name was Petra Vance, and she arrived the following morning in a gray suit with no visible sentiment about the circumstances that had produced the meeting. She was mid-40s, direct, and asked Claire questions for 3 hours, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who are building a case rather than having a conversation. She asked about the protective order, about the ribs, about the emergency room visit, the doctor who'd treated her, the nurse who'd been in the room. She asked about the 3 previous escape attempts in detail that made Claire feel briefly like the surface of the moon fully mapped, nowhere to hide. At the end of 3 hours, Petra set down her pen. This is manageable, she said. Not simple, not fast, but manageable. She looked at Claire directly. But I need you to understand something. If we pursue this legally, it becomes adversarial in ways that can't be controlled. Preston will use everything. His attorneys are good. They will find things. They will present them in ways that are designed to make you look unstable or dishonest or motivated by something other than the truth. She paused. You need to decide whether you're prepared for that. Claire thought about the paper on the table, the handwriting at the bottom. You know, I always finish what I start. She thought about the woman who'd moved to Atlanta. She thought about 2 years of kept receipts and photographs she'd taken of injuries when she could, and text messages she'd screenshotted and sent to an email address. Preston didn't know existed the small archive of evidence she'd been building since the 3rd escape attempt. When she'd decided that if she was going to be trapped, she was at least going to document the trap. I've been keeping records, she said. Petra went very still. Since when, she asked. About 10 months, Claire said. A pause. What kind of records? Petra asked. Photographs. Timestamps. Messages. 3 audio recordings I made on an old phone I bought with cash and kept in my car. She paused. I don't know if they're admissible. I didn't know Massachusetts wiretapping law when I made them. Petra picked up her pen. Tell me about the recordings, she said. The session went another 2 hours. When Petra finally left, Claire sat at the table for a long time with a cold cup of coffee and the specific exhaustion of having said everything she'd been carrying for 10 months out loud to a stranger who'd received it without flinching and started, turning it into something that might actually matter. Ronan came in from wherever he'd been during the legal session and looked at her. How are you? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Tired, she said, and something else I don't have a word for. Something like forward, he asked. She looked at him. Maybe, she said. He sat across the table. Outside, the harbor was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent to anything on land, carrying cargo and cold air toward the open Atlantic. She'd started to find the constancy of it useful. It didn't care about Preston Vardell or protective orders or cracked ribs or who kissed whom at a charity gala. It was just water doing what water does. Ronan, she said. Yeah. Why did you kiss me back? The question surprised him. She could see that. He sat with it for a moment, which she'd come to understand was his version of taking something seriously rather than dispatching it quickly. Because you were terrified and asking for help, and I could give it, he said. But you kissed me back, she said. You could have just put your arm around me, could have played it a dozen different ways. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I could have. She waited. He needed to believe it completely, he said. Preston. He needed to see something he couldn't argue was ambiguous. He paused. And he stopped and she said, And you surprised me, he said. It came out slightly differently than his other sentences, less constructed, less deliberate. I wasn't expecting you to surprise me. She looked at him across the table. What did you expect? She said. Honestly, he looked at the harbor. Someone who needed extracting. That's a situation I understand. You do it clean. You move the pieces. You solve the logistics. He paused. You're not that. She was quiet. What am I? She asked. He looked back at her. Still figuring that out, he said. It was not a romantic declaration. It wasn't supposed to be. But something in the room changed slightly, the way the temperature changes when a window has been left open, and you've gotten used to the cold, and then someone closes it. She picked up her coffee mug. It was empty. She went to make more. She was at the counter with the coffee machine when her new phone buzzed with a message from Petra. She read it, then read it again. The cash phone she'd left in her car, the one with the recordings, was no longer in the car. Someone had accessed the car at the parking garage attached to Preston's apartment building, where she'd left at the night of the gala in the chaos of leaving everything behind. The garage had her plate on file. The car was in Preston's name. He had the recordings. She set the phone down on the counter very carefully, like something that might break if she wasn't precise. Ronan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her face and didn't ask what had happened, yet. Just stood there, with the particular stillness of someone who has seen enough situations to know that some news needs a second before it becomes a conversation. She turned around. He has the recordings, she said. The room went quiet enough that she could hear the harbor. The recordings were gone. Claire stood in Ronan's kitchen and said it again, because the first time it had come out too flat, too contained, like a sentence that didn't understand its own weight. He has the recordings, she said. The phone was in my car. In the garage attached to his building, he had access. Ronan didn't move from the doorway immediately. He looked at her the way he looked at things that required rapid and accurate assessment, not cold, but precise. Then he turned his head toward the hallway. Wade, he said. Wade appeared from somewhere in the penthouse within 15 seconds, which told her he'd been close and paying attention. Ronan handed him the phone, with Petra's message still open on the screen. Wade read it. His expression didn't change, which meant it was bad. The garage has cameras, Wade said. Call Theo, Ronan said. Wade was already dialing. Claire stood at the counter with her hands flat against the surface and tried to build the architecture of what this meant. 10 months of recordings. 3 of them were audio Preston's voice, his specific language, the particular cadence of a man who became someone else when no one was watching. She'd recorded them on a phone she'd bought $40 cash at a convenience store during a window, when Preston had believed she was at a client meeting. She'd hidden it in the car in the gap between the driver's seat and the center console, under a flap of carpet she'd pried up with a butter knife. She'd listened to those recordings once each, just to confirm they existed. Then she'd locked that phone and left it there, because carrying it felt too dangerous and destroying it felt like erasing the only objective evidence that what she remembered was real. Now Preston had them. The question was whether he'd listened to them yet. The question after that was what he would do with them. Ronan came back into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter a few feet from her and looked at the ceiling for exactly 2 seconds, a thing she'd noticed he did when he was organizing something internally, then looked at her. Talk me through what's on them, he said. 3 recordings, she said. Different dates. The first one is from about 10 months ago, after the night she stopped, recalibrated, after an incident. He came into the bedroom the next morning while I was still in bed, and he explained to me very calmly why what happened was my fault. The second one is from about 6 months ago. We were in the kitchen. He found out I'd had coffee with a former colleague, a woman, and hadn't mentioned it. The third one is from 3 months ago. What's on the third one? Ronan asked. She looked at the counter. He talks about the protective order, she said. Not explicitly. But there's a reference. He says something like that piece of paper doesn't exist anymore. And then he says something about the people who made sure of it. She paused. It's the closest thing I had to proof that the order didn't just fall through the system accidentally. A silence. That's significant, Ronan said. That's why I kept it, she said. That's why I was careful about the phone. I knew if he found it, he'd use it, Ronan said, or destroy it, or both. Wade came back in. He put the phone on the counter between them. Garage camera shows his vehicle entering the structure. At 11:14 last night, he said. He was in the garage for approximately 40 minutes. Left at 11:52. 40 minutes, Claire said. He was looking for something specific. He found the car. He found the phone, Wade said. The question is whether he already knew it was there, or whether he searched and got lucky. He knew, Claire said. Certain, he goes through my things. He always has. He wouldn't have spent 40 minutes in that garage on a guess. Which means he knew about the phone before last night, Ronan said. She felt something cold move through her. Then why wait? She said. If he knew about it, why not take it earlier? Why now? The three of them looked at each other. Because earlier it wasn't useful, Wade said slowly. Earlier you were still in the apartment. Still accessible. He didn't need leverage because he had physical access. He paused. He waited until you were gone. Until there was a legal situation developing. Until the recordings became the most valuable piece of the whole puzzle. He planned this, she said. He's been planning since the night of the gala, Ronan said. We've been managing the situation. He's been managing the war. She had to sit down. She pulled out the kitchen stool and sat on it and pressed both hands against her face and breathed. She wasn't crying. She was past crying at the moment she was in the space after the wave. Hits when you're trying to figure out which direction is up. Preston had the recordings. He had the protective order with its documented inconsistencies. He had a firm of attorneys and a private investigator, and whatever relationships he'd built into the systems that were supposed to protect people like her. He had 10 years of carefully cultivated influence in a city that rewarded men who looked like him and spoke like him, and donated to the right causes at the right galas. And she had borrowed sweatpants and a graphic design project due in 11 days. What does he do with them? She asked from behind her hands. He has options, Ronan said. He didn't dress it up. She'd come to rely on that the way he refused to tell her what she wanted to hear when what she needed was accuracy. He could take them to his attorneys and use them to preemptively build a narrative. Suggest you were surveilling him. Depending on how the recordings were made and what Massachusetts law says about consent, he could potentially use the recordings against you, rather than the other way around. She lowered her hands. One-party consent, she said. I read about it. Massachusetts is a two-party state. I needed his consent to record him. Yes, Ronan said. So the recordings aren't admissible. Probably not in their current form, Ronan said. Petra would know the exact parameters. But beyond admissibility, he paused. He could use them to discredit you. If he plays them selectively, edits context, presents them as evidence of your instability rather than his behavior. He could, Wade said. He has the means. Claire sat very still. She thought about the third recording. Preston's voice. That piece of paper doesn't exist anymore. The satisfaction in it. Quiet pleasure of a man who had dismantled something that was supposed to protect someone and felt no particular way about it, except competent. Means that she thought about how she'd listened to that recording once, alone in her car in a parking lot, and had pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and allowed herself 4 minutes of crying. Then she'd locked the phone and driven home and made dinner and acted like a woman with no recordings in her car. She'd spent 10 months building something she believed was insurance, and Preston had turned it into a weapon pointed back at her. She called Petra. The attorney answered on the second ring, which told her Petra had been waiting for this call. I know, Petra said. Wade reached out. I've been on it for 20 minutes. The two-party consent issue, Claire said. It's real, Petra said. In Massachusetts, recording someone without their consent is a criminal violation. Not a technicality, an actual violation. If Preston takes this to the DA framing you as someone who illegally surveilled him, we have a problem. A pause. But Claire waited. The content of those recordings, even if inadmissible as evidence you gathered, can still inform how we build the case, Petra said. If we can get him to make statements in a controlled legal context that mirror what's on those recordings, deposition, testimony, the recordings become corroboration of pattern rather than evidence in themselves. Another pause. It's harder. It's a longer road, but it's not over. Is it a road we can actually walk? Claire asked. A beat. With what you told me yesterday about the timestamps, the photographs, the text messages, yes, Petra said. The recordings were your strongest piece, but they weren't your only piece. Her voice carried the particular quality of professional steadiness, the kind that doesn't mean everything is fine, but means the person speaking has dealt with worse and hasn't stopped working. I need you to sit tight and not contact anyone from Preston's world. Not mutual acquaintances, not colleagues. No one. Let me drive this today. She hung up. Ronan was watching her. Longer road, she said. We'll walk it, he said. She looked at him. You keep saying we, she said. Is that a problem? She thought about it. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He accepted that without argument. The day moved slowly, and then suddenly, the way days do when you're waiting for something to land. Seize. Claire went back to the laptop and worked on the restaurant branding project because the alternative was sitting still inside her own head, which was not a livable environment. She rebuilt 2 of the 3 logo concepts from scratch, using the fragments she'd recovered from the cloud. She worked until her eyes burned, and then kept working. At 4:15, Wade knocked on the doorframe of the dining room. She looked up. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not alarm exactly. Wade didn't appear to have a full alarm setting, but a tightening around the eyes that communicated the information before he said the words. We have a situation, he said. She saved her file. Tell me. Preston gave a statement to a reporter this afternoon, Wade said. It went online 40 minutes ago. He put his tablet on the table and turned it toward her. She read it. Preston's statement was 4 paragraphs and written in the specific, sorrowful language of a man explaining a painful private matter to a public that hadn't asked. It described Claire as someone he'd loved and tried to help through what he characterized as ongoing mental health struggles. It mentioned with grave regret that she had recently left their home in a disturbed state and placed herself in a dangerous situation. It expressed concern for her safety and well-being. It noted, with evident reluctance, that he had become aware of certain troubling behaviors, including the illegal recording of private conversations that spoke to the depth of her difficulties. He hadn't used Ronan's name. He hadn't needed to. The phrase dangerous situation did the work a name would have done and left Preston with legal distance from the implication. She read it twice. Then she put the tablet down very carefully and looked at the harbor. He moved fast, she said. Faster than I expected, Wade said. Which means he had this ready. He drafted this before he went to that garage last night. He already knew what he was going to say when he had the phone. He just needed the phone to give him the angle, she said. The illegal recordings. Something to attach the instability narrative to. She pressed her finger against the table again, that habit she'd developed, anchoring herself to a surface. How much coverage is it getting? Enough, Wade said. It'll be in 2 city papers by morning. His attorney gave quotes supporting the statement. She sat there. She felt something happening in her chest, not breaking exactly, but a compression, like something that had been held inflated, was slowly losing pressure. She'd known he would fight. She'd told herself she was prepared for him to fight. But knowing something intellectually and feeling the actual weight of it land were different experiences, and she'd been dumb to think otherwise. She'd been public. She'd kissed a man at a gala in front of 500 people. She'd said he hurts me in a room full of witnesses. She'd walked out. She'd had 3 days of relative stability and a lawyer and a plan and the feeling for the first time in 2 years of forward motion. And Preston had spent that same time building the counter-narrative so carefully, so patiently, with such specific knowledge of her vulnerabilities, that he'd turned the same facts she was standing on, torn her into evidence against her. Ronan came back at 6. Wade had left the tablet where it was, a sound before sitting. He saw it when he walked in and read the statement without sitting down and then put the tablet face down on the table, which was the most visibly emotional response she'd seen from him. That his attorney wrote this, Ronan said. Doesn't matter who wrote it, she said. It matters for what comes next, he said. An attorney wrote this, which means Preston is building towards something legal. This isn't an emotional reaction, it's a predicate. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He's setting up a narrative so that when he files something, there's public context already established. Files what? She said. I don't know yet. He looked at her. How are you? The question startled her, not because it was unexpected, but because she didn't have an honest answer ready. I'm angry, she said. I keep waiting to be scared, and instead I'm angry. Is that wrong? No, he said. He called me unstable, she said, in print, with quotes from his attorney. He talked about my mental health struggles like he's been watching me deteriorate and bearing it privately out of love. Her voice was level. She was working to keep it level. He has people believing that. Right now. People who know my name are reading that and believing it. Some of them, Ronan said. Not enough, she said. Same word Wade had used. She was tired of the word. Ronan looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that wasn't his usual controlled register, something that had friction in it, something less managed. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She looked at him. His voice had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. "I spoke to someone today," he said, "about Preston's financial relationships. The development deal specifically." He paused. "I found out something that changes the picture." "Tell me," she said. He looked at his hands for a moment. The gesture was so uncharacteristic Ronan, who maintained eye contact the way other people maintained posture, that it made her sit forward. "The development deal Preston has been pursuing," he said. "The one Alcott's endorsement was supposed to unlock. It's connected to a property on the northern waterfront." He stopped. "I have holdings adjacent to that property. Commercial shipping infrastructure." She waited. "Preston has known that for at least 8 months," Ronan said. "The deal he's been building would require rezoning that effectively devalues my adjacent holdings." He stopped again. "Someone I trust told me today that Preston began pursuing that deal specifically because of the adjacent holdings. Because of me." She stared at him. "He was targeting you," she said. "Professionally," Ronan said. "Through legitimate channels. Rezoning, political pressure, the kind of move that costs money and influence rather than anything direct." He looked at her. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the full context of what you're in the middle of. What started as your situation and my decision to help, there's a layer underneath it that I wasn't aware of until today." She sat back. The room reorganized itself around this information. She could feel it happening, the slight shift of every previous conversation, every decision, every moment of the last 11 days, rotating slightly on its axis and showing a different face. "Does that change why you helped me?" she asked. "No," he said immediately. "I didn't know about the development deal when you kissed me at that gala. I made the decision I made because of what I saw on your wrist." He paused. "But I won't hide from you that the situation is more complicated than I understood when it started." She looked at him for a long time. "Is there more?" she said. A beat that lasted too long. "Wade," she said, without looking away from Ronan. Ronan said, "Claire." "Is there more?" she said. Not a question this time. He closed his eyes briefly, 1 second, then opened them. "The private investigator Preston hired," he said. "Galloway's office. I know Galloway. He's done work for me in the past, not recently, not in the last 2 years, but there's a history." He said it with the particular quality of a man who has decided that incomplete honesty is worse than the full version. If Preston found that out, and he probably did, because he's thorough, then any investigation Galloway runs is compromised. He would have divided loyalty at minimum. "You used the same investigator that Preston hired," she said. "In the past," he said. "Not currently, but Preston knows that." "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window. The harbor was doing its evening thing, the light going amber and then gray, the water darkening, the lights of the channel markers appearing one by one. She stood there and breathed. She wasn't angry at Ronan exactly. She was angry at the shape of the thing, the way every layer she pulled back revealed another layer, the way nothing in her life for the last 2 years had been what it appeared to be on the surface, and the way she had walked directly from one complicated situation into the orbit of another complicated man, and convinced herself the complexity was manageable, because he made eggs at midnight and spoke to her like she had a functioning brain. She heard him stand up behind her. "I should have looked harder before I told you it was safe," he said. "I should have mapped the full picture before you were inside it." She turned around. "Why didn't you?" she asked. "Because I made the decision in a ballroom in 30 seconds, and I stand by the decision," he said. "I don't stand by every consequence of it, but I won't pretend the decision was wrong." She looked at him. She thought about Preston reading that protective order in his apartment, about him standing in a parking garage at 11 at night going through her car, about 4 paragraphs of careful, devastating prose designed to turn her pain into evidence of her pathology. She thought about the woman in Atlanta. She thought about what it meant that Preston had been moving pieces against Ronan before the gala, that her escape and her refuge existed inside. A war she hadn't known was already in progress. She thought about Theo recovering her cloud files, about Petra and 3 hours of questions, and the phrase "this is manageable," about Wade and the cold practicality of a man who'd said "not the way Preston is," and meant it as reassurance. She thought about the borrowed sweatpants and the laptop and the restaurant branding project. She thought about what she'd said to Petra. If I go back, the fight doesn't go away. He keeps it. Okay, she said. Ronan looked at her. Okay, what? Okay, I'm not leaving, she said. And okay, you owe me full information from this point forward. Everything. Not the version that keeps me from worrying everything. He didn't agree quickly, which was the right response. He took a moment with it, the way he took moments with things that mattered. Agreed, he said. And you should know something, she said. She crossed her arms. I've been in a controlled situation for 2 years. I know what it looks like when someone is managing information to manage me. I'm not doing that again. With anyone. I understand, he said. Do you? She said. Yes, he said. And the simplicity of it had the same quality as Wade's no, not designed to comfort, just accurate. She went back to the table, opened the laptop, stared at the restaurant logo for a moment. The statement he gave, she said. The press statement. We need to respond. Petra is working on not through Petra, she said. Not through attorneys. That'll look like you're managing me. Like I don't have a voice. She turned to look at him. I need to make a statement my own. Not a legal document. Not a press release. Me. A pause. That's a risk, he said. Everything is a risk, she said. At least this one's mine. He sat down across from her again. What do you want to say? He asked. She thought about it. She thought about 2 years and 3 escape attempts and a parking garage at 11 at night and 4 paragraphs of careful poison and the woman in Atlanta who signed something and disappeared. The truth, she said. Just the truth. In plain language. With my name on it. The statement took 2 hours to write. She wrote it herself on the laptop while Ronan sat at the far end of the table and Wade came in and out, and neither of them suggested changes she didn't ask for. Petra called twice, and Claire told her what she was doing, and Petra said 3 sentences about legal tisk, and then said all right and asked to read it before it went anywhere. It was 460 words. It had no legalese. It didn't mention Ronan by name. It described, in the plainest language she could find, what 2 years had looked like from the inside. It included one detail, the cracked ribs, the emergency room, the protective order that had vanished that was specific and dateable and documented in a hospital file that existed whether Preston's attorneys liked it or not. At the end she wrote, I am not unstable. I am tired of being afraid. There's a difference. She sent it to Petra. Petra called back in 40 minutes. It's legally clean, Petra said. The hospital record supports the rib claim. The protective order filing is a matter of public record. Even if the order itself was removed, the filing timestamp exists. A pause. I'd add one line at the end. Just one. Referencing that documentation exists and will be part of ongoing legal proceedings. Does it change the tone? Claire asked. It changes him, Petra said. It puts him on notice that you're not undefended. She added the line. It went online at 9:47 that evening through a statement platform that Theo sets up in 30 minutes. Within 2 hours it had been picked up by one city reporter, then a second, then a wire service that fed regional outlets. By midnight, Preston's 4 paragraphs had company. She sat at the dining table with the laptop and watched the numbers on Theo's tracking dashboard climb and felt something she didn't have a name for, not triumph. Nothing that clean. Something more like the sensation of having been pushed underwater for a very long time and finally getting her face above the surface and taking the first real breath. She was still in danger. The legal road was longer now. The recordings were gone. The investigator was compromised. Preston was building something she could feel the architecture of it, even if she couldn't see the full design yet. But she had breathed. She was still here. She closed the laptop and looked at Ronan across the table. I need to tell you something too, she said. He looked at her. She hadn't planned to say it tonight. She'd carried it for 3 weeks since the test, since the negative result that hadn't felt as clean as it should have. Since the faint second line she'd initially dismissed as a shadow, and then had not been able to dismiss at all. I think I'm pregnant, she said. The room went completely still. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Ronan didn't move. Was sitting across the table from her, and he didn't lean forward, didn't lean back, didn't do any of the things people do when they're buying time to construct a reaction. He just went very still, the way he went still when something required his full attention, and looked at her. How long have you known? He said. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe longer. The test I took 3 weeks ago had a second line I told myself was a shadow. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I took another one this morning. Wade keeps a medical kit that would embarrass most urgent care clinics. There was a test in it. And not a shadow, she said. He exhaled, just once. A controlled breath that was the closest thing to visible emotion she'd seen from him since the night he'd put his arm around her in the ballroom. Does Preston know? He asked. No, she said. I haven't told anyone. I'm telling you now because she stopped. Thought about why. Because I told you I was done with managed information. And this is information that affects you. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. What do you want to do? He said. She'd expected something else. She wasn't sure what alarm, or the particular kind of careful neutrality that men deploy when they're waiting to see which direction the situation expects them to face. What she didn't expect was the question directed at her wants, cleanly, without the scaffolding of what he might prefer underneath it. I don't know yet, she said. I've been carrying it for 3 weeks without knowing. She exhaled. I need a day. Maybe 2. Okay, he said. That's it, she said. What else should I say? She looked at him. Most people would say more, she said. I'm not most people, he said. And you've had enough people tell you what to think about your own life. She sat with that. Outside, the harbor was black and completely still, the way water gets in the deep hours of the night when the wind has gone somewhere else. I want the baby, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Not tentative certain, just small. The way certain things are small when they're very true. I'm terrified, but I want it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then we figure that out, he said. Ronan, we figure it out, he said again. Steady. Not tonight. Tonight you sleep, she almost argued. She was good at arguing with herself into exhaustion. Instead, she closed the laptop and went to the guest room and lay down and was asleep before she finished the thought she'd started. She dreamed about nothing she could remember. In the morning, everything moved fast. Petra called at 7:40 with news that Preston's attorneys had filed a civil harassment claim against Claire, not against Ronan, against Claire, alleging she had conducted illegal surveillance of Preston Vardell in violation of Massachusetts wiretapping statutes, and that the harassment and reputational damage caused by her public statement constituted tortious conduct. Claire read the filing summary on her phone, sitting on the edge of the guest bed, still in yesterday's clothes. He's sousing me, she said. He's creating a counterposition, Petra said. It's designed to muddy the water before we can file anything ourselves. If he establishes you as the aggressor in the legal record, any domestic abuse claims you make read as retaliatory. Can he win? The wiretapping violation is real, Petra said. The civil harassment claim is thinner, but not nothing. We can fight both. A pause. But fighting both simultaneously is resource-intensive. He knows that. He's trying to exhaust me, Claire said. He's trying to exhaust your support, Petra said. He knows you can't fund this fight yourself. He's testing whether the people around you have the appetite for a long war. She went to find Ronan. He was in the kitchen with Wade, and they were already in it, both of them standing. Ronan with a coffee he'd stopped drinking, Wade with his tablet, the specific body language of men who'd been talking since before she woke up. She put her phone on the counter between them, with the filing summary visible. I know, Ronan said. How long have you known? Since 6:15, he said. Petra copied my attorney on the filing. She felt a quick flash of something not quite anger, the precursor to it. You let me find out on my own instead of waking me up. You needed sleep, he said. That's not your call, she said. He held her gaze. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. The apology was simple and immediate, and she could tell it cost him something, which meant it was real. She let it settle. What's the play? She asked. We file first, Ronan said. Today, if Petra can manage it. Criminal complaint for domestic assault, the ribs, documented, dated with the ER record. We file it before the civil harassment motion has time to establish itself as the primary narrative. He looked at her. Once there's an active criminal complaint, the framing of this entire situation changes. He's no longer a concerned ex-partner dealing with an unstable woman. He's a defendant. What does he do when we file? She asked. He escalates, Wade said. He didn't say it like a prediction. He said it like a thing that was already in progress. To what? She said. A silence between the two men that had texture in it. He's already escalating, Ronan said. Last night, after your statement went online, 2 of my restaurant managers received visits from city health inspectors. Unscheduled. Both restaurants passed, but he's going after your businesses, she said. He's going after my cash flow, Ronan said. He knows a sustained legal defense costs money. He's trying to create pressure points. He paused. And this morning, one of my shipping contracts, a significant one, received an inquiry from a state commerce office suggesting a routine audit. Is it routine? The timing isn't routine, Wade said. Claire leaned against the counter. She understood what she was looking at. Preston wasn't just fighting her anymore. He'd opened just fighting her on. He'd opened a second front against Ronan, and he was running them, simultaneously calibrating the pressure so that maintaining her defense became increasingly expensive. The longer this went, the more it cost Ronan. And at some point, Preston was betting on this, the math would change. He thinks she'll decide I'm not worth it, she said to Ronan. Ronan looked at her steadily. He's wrong, he said. How can you be sure, she said. You've known me for 2 weeks. 12 days, he said. And I'm sure because walking away now isn't something I'm capable of. Not from this, he paused. Not from you. She looked at him. He meant it. She could read the difference now between what he said because it was strategically appropriate and what he said because it was true. The texture was different, the weight of it. A sound like green wood splitting. She looked away before the moment could become something larger than either of them knew what to do with. File today, she said. Petra files today. Petra filed at 2:47 in the afternoon. The criminal complaint was 12 pages, attached medical records, photographic documentation, and a sworn statement from the emergency room physician who had treated Claire's cracked ribs 8 months prior and had, in his own notes, documented his clinical assessment that the injury pattern was inconsistent with a fall and consistent with direct blunt force impact. By 4 o'clock, Preston's attorneys had been served. By 5:15, Preston had done something that none of them had predicted. He showed up, not at the building, not at the front door. He showed up at the construction site, 2 blocks east, that abutted a parcel Ronan's shipping infrastructure connected to, technically public access, on a public street, where a man could stand and look at a building without violating any specific legal boundary. Wade got the alert from Dev, who was doing a routine perimeter check. He came to Ronan first. Ronan went to the window that faced that direction. In the fading afternoon light, a figure was visible on the street, hands in a coat pocket, looking up at the building. The distance was too great to make out his face clearly, but the stance was enough. Claire had spent 2 years memorizing that stance. That's him, she said from beside Ronan. Ronan was already on the phone. Don't approach him, he said into it. Don't make contact. Document. He paused. And get Petra on the line. She stood at the window and watched Preston stand on a public street 2 blocks away and felt something strange happen in her body. Not fear, but a recognition so deep it was almost physical. This was what he did. This was his specific dialect of control. He didn't need to come through the door. He just needed her to know he was there. To know he could always find the perimeter of wherever she'd retreated to. To know that the walls she'd built were visible to him, and he was measuring them at his leisure. He wants me to see him, she said. Yes, Ronan said. He wants me to know the walls aren't high enough, she said. Ronan turned from the window and looked at her with an expression that was harder than his usual register. They're high enough, he said. Preston stood on that street for 22 minutes. Then he left. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and calculated the pregnancy, the filing, the civil harassment counterclaim, the business pressure on Ronan, the missing recordings, the compromised investigator, Galloway's divided loyalties, and tried to find the shape of what Preston was building, because men like him didn't do things that didn't fit a larger architecture. In the morning, she had it. She went to Ronan before he'd finished his first coffee. He's going to do something physical, she said. Not to me directly. Something that can't be walked back in court. Ronan put down the coffee. Explain, he said. He's been methodical, she said. Everything up to now has been legal or at the boundary of legal. The attorney filings, the press statement, the business pressure. He's creating a record of you as someone who interferes with his life. She looked at Ronan. What happens if something violent occurs, and the record says you had motive and means, and you've been escalating against him? A silence. He frames me for it, Ronan said. He frames you for it, she said. And suddenly, the domestic abuse complaint gets buried under a criminal investigation of a mafia boss. She pressed her finger to the table. He's not trying to win the legal fight. He's trying to create a different fight entirely. Wade was in the doorway. She didn't know when he'd appeared. She's right, Wade said. The business pressure isn't about money. It's about documentation. He's building a record that Ronan has been retaliating against him since the night of the gala. So when something happens, Ronan started. He has the predicate, Claire finished. The three of them stood in the kitchen in a silence that had weight. He'll stage something, Ronan said. He'll make it look like one of my people. Or he'll provoke something, Wade said. He stood on that street last night for 22 minutes. If someone from our team had approached him, he'd have video of it, Ronan said. From 3 angles, probably. Claire looked at them. So we can't engage, she said, no matter what he does. Any reaction from your side becomes the thing he's been building toward. Which means he has freedom to escalate further, Ronan said, because he knows we can't respond. What does further look like, she said. Nobody answered that immediately, because the answer was what they'd each been sitting with and not saying. 36 hours later, they found out. Claire was at her clinic appointment. She'd made it carefully, Petra's recommendation, Ronan's security protocol, 3 days of back and forth about timing and location, and which medical practice had a private entrance and no staff with ties to Preston's social circle. The clinic they'd chosen was a small private practice in Brookline that Ronan's own physician used for family members who needed discretion. The appointment was under a name that wasn't Claire's, linked to a patient file that Theo had set up. Through channels Claire hadn't asked about. She'd gone with Dev and a second man named Carver, who she'd met twice before, and who communicated primarily through positioning, where he stood, how he angled, the way he moved through a space. A soundlit Greenwood splitting. Both of them had done the preliminary walkthrough of the clinic at 7 that morning before her 9:30 appointment. Ronan had a meeting he couldn't move a shipping contract, negotiation that had been rescheduled twice already, and canceling a third time would cause the kind of financial damage that Preston was trying to engineer. He'd wanted to reschedule the appointment instead. She'd said no. The appointment is happening. She'd told him that morning. I'm 12 weeks. I need to hear the heartbeat. She'd said it plainly, without apology. I need that today. He'd looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Dev and Carver were competent and thorough, and she felt, walking into the clinic, as safe as she'd felt in any 2-week stretch of her recent life, which wasn't entirely reassuring, but was what she had. The clinic was small, a waiting area with 6 chairs, a reception desk, 2 examination rooms, and an ultrasound suite at the end of a short hallway. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s who smiled briefly at Claire and didn't look twice at Dev, standing near the door. She was taken to the ultrasound suite at 9:34. The technician was a young woman with short red hair and the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who'd done this exact thing several thousand times. She explained the procedure, asked Claire to lie back, applied the gel to the transducer with the practiced movement of someone not thinking about the movement at all. Then her pager went off. She looked at it, frowned slightly. I'm sorry. Just one moment. She set the transducer down and went to the door and spoke briefly to someone Claire couldn't see in the hallway, then stepped fully out and pulled the door partially closed behind her. Claire lay on the examination table and stared at the ceiling and listened. The clinic was quiet, professionally quiet, the padded hush of a place designed to feel private. She could hear the faint sound of the reception area. She could hear, or thought she could, Dev's voice somewhere distant asking something. Then the door opened. She turned her head. The person who entered was wearing scrubs light blue, the same shade as the technicians, and had a lanyard with a clinic ID around the neck. Claire looked at the face above the scrubs. Her entire body went cold. Preston closed the door behind him. He looked different than he had at the gala. Not worse. Exactly, he'd never been a man who wore his damage externally. But something had reorganized behind his eyes. The performance quality she'd always recognized in him. The constant calibration of how he was landing in a room, it was still there. But underneath it, something else was running. Something that had stopped being careful. He looked at her lying on the examination table in a medical gown, and he looked at the ultrasound equipment, and his gaze traveled to the screen and registered what it showed, or rather, what it didn't yet show. What it was waiting to show, and she saw his face do something she had never seen it do in 2 years. He went completely blank, not controlled, not composed. Actually blank, the way a face goes when the person behind it is receiving information that is reorganizing something fundamental. You're pregnant, he said. It wasn't a question. You need to leave, Claire said. Her voice came out even. She didn't know how. Whose is it? He said. She didn't answer, Claire. Something cracked through the blankness. Whose child is that? You need to leave right now, she said. She was sitting up on the table. She didn't remember deciding to sit up. You need to leave this room before what? He took a step toward her. He wasn't loud. That was the thing she'd forgotten about him, how quiet he got when he was at the edge of something. The quiet was worse than the volume. Before Whitlock's men dragged me out? You think they're outside that door right now? Yes, she said. I got past them, he said simply. I've had 6 days to study this clinic. The service entrance, the staff schedule, the technician who called in sick this morning. He said it the way he'd always said the things he'd arranged, with a quiet, specific pleasure that wasn't pride exactly, more like satisfaction at precision. I just needed to know where you were. And you made that very easy. She looked at the door. She looked at the heavy ultrasound transducer sitting in its cradle beside the machine. She looked at Preston, standing between her and the door, with his hand reaching into the pocket of the stolen scrubs. She saw the gun before she fully processed that she was seeing it. It wasn't large. That was somehow the detail that stayed in her mind, the size of it, the compactness, the way it fit his hand like something practical rather than dramatic. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. And for one terrible second she almost believed him, because this was his voice, the quiet one, the level one, the one that had preceded things she'd been told were her fault. I just need you to understand something. This he gestured at the ultrasound equipment, at her, at whatever the screen was waiting to show. This doesn't happen. You don't get to have this with him. That's not, he stopped, breathed. That's not what this looks like. Preston, she said. You left, he said. You left and you made it public and you filed a complaint and you stood in front of cameras and you said things and now you're another stop. His composure was fracturing in a way she'd never seen. You don't get to do all of that and then have a child with Ronan Whitlock. You don't get to Preston. She kept her voice low. She kept it steady. She'd read somewhere, a long time ago, in a resource she'd found minutes she'd had alone with a hospital computer after the ribs she'd read that you keep them talking. You watch the hands. You watch the door. Look at me. He looked at her. This is the part where you still have choices, she said. Right now, you can walk back out the service entrance. You can stop, he said. You can stop talking to me like I'm a situation you're managing, he said. And something in his voice went jagged. I built 6 years around you. 6 years of, he stopped again, pressed his lips together, looked at the gun in his hand. I had everything arranged. Everything. And he looked at her. You kissed him in front of everyone I know, because you were going to hurt me when we got home, she said. I never the ribs, Preston. That was 2 cracked ribs, she said. 1 emergency room. 1 protective order that you had pulled from the system. 1 woman in Atlanta who signed something and disappeared. She looked at him. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, but her voice was still there, still level, something she didn't understand about herself, that she was grateful for. This is what you built. Not 6 years, this. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Not remorse, she didn't think he was capable of remorse in the way other people were capable of it. Something adjacent to it. Something that happened when the architecture you'd constructed to explain yourself to yourself suddenly didn't add up. He raised the gun. The door burst open. She grabbed the ultrasound transducer in the same motion, both things happening in the same fraction of a second. The door and her hands. The weight of the instrument solid and real in her grip, and she threw it. It was not a careful throw. It was not aimed with precision. It was the throw of a woman on a medical table in a paper gown who had 1 object and 1 opportunity and 2 years of accumulated fear turning into something that finally had a direction. It caught Preston at the temple. The sound was wrong, not the clean sound of things in movies, but something full and immediate, a sound with weight in it. His head snapped sideways. The gun fired into the wall above the door, the sound enormous in the small room, the kind of sound that reorganizes your hearing for the seconds afterward. Wade came through the door. He didn't hesitate, didn't call out, didn't perform the entry. He was simply suddenly inside the room, with his full weight and momentum driving toward Preston, who was staggering sideways with his hand at his temple and the gun dropping away from his grip and Wade's forearm coming across his chest like something installed rather than thrown. Preston went down. Not gracefully. He hit the examination table on the way and the edge of the equipment cart and ended up on the floor with Wade's knee on his upper back, and his arm wrenched up at an angle that produced a sound that was clearly involuntary. The gun was against the far baseboard. Dev was in the doorway behind Wade. Carver was behind Dev. The room smelled like the shot something chemical and sharp that she'd never smelled in before and would never forget. Claire sat on the examination table in the aftermath of everything, with the gel still on her abdomen and the ultrasound machine still on and the screen still dark and her hands she looked at, her hands absolutely shaking. The controlled stillness she'd maintained for the last 4 minutes had dissolved the moment Preston hit the floor, and now her body was collecting its invoice. She was shaking from her hands to her feet. Her teeth were doing something she couldn't control. She pressed both palms hard against her thighs and breathed through it. Wade had Preston's wrists pinned. He looked up at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. She checked. Ran a fast internal inventory the way she'd learned to do. "No," she said. "The baby," she said immediately after. She looked at the ultrasound machine. Sounded San. At the transducer on the floor, the one she'd thrown, the one she'd picked up off the machine and used as the only weapon available to her, and she thought about the screen that had been waiting to show her something. The technician appeared in the doorway. Her face was the face of someone who had heard a gunshot and run toward it rather than away, which told Claire something about her. "Is anyone hurt?" the technician said. "No," Claire said. "Can you—" She gestured at the machine, at herself. At the question she couldn't make into a full sentence. The technician came into the room. She picked up a second transducer from the equipment cart. She looked at Preston on the floor, at Wade's knee on his back, at the gun against the baseboard, and her face did the thing faces do when they are processing an extraordinary situation and choosing to prioritize the practical. She applied gel. She pressed the transducer to Claire's abdomen. The room was absolutely silent, except for the sound of Preston's breathing against the floor and the small electronic hum of the machine. The screen changed. Then the sound came through the speaker, small, fast, completely steady. A heartbeat. Claire pressed both hands over her mouth. She heard it, and the shaking in her changed its character. Entirely stopped being fear and became something else, something that had no name she knew, something that started behind her sternum and moved outward. Strong, regular, completely stubbornly alive. Wade looked up at her from the floor. His expression was not his usual expression. Outside the door, she heard Ronan's voice in the hallway, not what he said, just the sound of it, recognizable even through the wall, the particular frequency of a man who has arrived somewhere too late and is not yet certain what he's arrived at. The door opened. He looked at Wade on the floor, at Preston pinned beneath him, at the gun against the baseboard and the bullet hole in the wall above the door and the smell that was still in the room. Then he looked at Claire. She was sitting on the examination table with both hands pressed over her mouth and the ultrasound monitor, showing a small, rapid, unmistakable heartbeat beside her, and her eyes were doing something they hadn't done once in the 14 days since she'd walked across a ballroom toward a stranger. She was crying. Ronan crossed the room in 4 steps. He didn't say anything. He pulled her into his arms, not carefully, not with the controlled deliberateness he usually moved through the world with, but with the specific urgency of a man who has spent the last 11 minutes imagining arriving too late, and she felt him shake just once against her, and then he held on. "The baby," she said into his shoulder. Her voice was completely wrecked. He pulled back enough to look at her face. She pointed at the monitor. He turned and looked at the screen, at the small, fast pulse of something that was new and specific and entirely unimpressed by everything that had just happened in the room around it. His face did something she had never seen a face do. Behind them, Preston said something from the floor. Neither of them looked at him. Ronan reached up and touched the monitor screen, not the controls, just the screen, just the image with 2 fingers, like a man confirming that something real is real. Outside the door, sirens were starting somewhere in the middle distance, moving closer through the Brookline streets, and Preston Vardell was on the floor of an ultrasound suite with Wade Merrick's knee on his back and a stolen clinic ID around his neck and a weapon that had discharged once into a wall, and all of that was about to become the most documented afternoon of his very carefully constructed life. But in the room in this specific moment, there was only the monitor, and the sound coming through it, and Ronan's hand still pressed against the screen, and Claire's face against his shoulder, and the heartbeat that just kept going, indifferent to everything, keeping its own time. The sirens arrived before Preston stopped bleeding. The cut at his temple where the transducer had caught him wasn't deep, but it bled the way head wounds do dramatically, disproportionately, turning the collar of the stolen scrubs dark and making the responding officer's first assessment more complicated than it needed to be. Wade had maintained his position on Preston's back through the whole of it, one knee, one arm pinned, not speaking, not adjusting, just holding the geometry of the situation until someone with a badge arrived to take it off his hands. Claire sat on the examination table and watched two Brookline police officers enter the room and do what officers do when they arrive at a scene that is already resolved and must be reconstructed: the quick visual inventory, the positions of people, the weapon against the baseboard, the hole in the wall, the ultrasound machine still running beside a woman in a medical gown who was not crying anymore, but whose face held the residue of it. Ronan stepped back when the officers entered. Not far, just enough to give them the geometry they needed. He stood at Claire's left, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and said nothing. Which was the right decision. A man with Ronan Whitlock's specific reputation, in a room with a gun on the floor, needed to be very still and very quiet until the situation established its own narrative. Preston's was handcuffed. He didn't fight it. That was the thing she noticed, watching from the table. The man who had come into this room with a plan, with 6 days of observation behind him, with stolen scrubs and a borrowed ID and a weapon, and the particular momentum of someone who had decided on an outcome, he went into the handcuffs with the specific deflation of a plan that has fully collapsed. His face was the face of someone who has arrived at the end of a logic that no longer holds. He looked at her once, from the floor, while they were getting him upright. She looked back. She didn't feel the things she'd expected to feel, not triumph, not relief, not the clean resolution of a conclusion. She felt something more complicated and less comfortable. Something like the exhaustion that comes after. The exhaustion that comes that you've been holding yourself together through an emergency, and the emergency is finally actually ended, and your body is presenting you with the full invoice. She felt it in her hands first, then her jaw, then somewhere behind her sternum, a loosening that was almost painful. A detective arrived 20 minutes after the first officers. His name was Caruso 50s, gray at the temples, the bearing of a man who had worked on-stream scenes long enough to have a sense of humor about very little of it. He looked at the room. He looked at the gun. He looked at Preston being walked out. He looked at Wade and then at Ronan, and something in the sequence of that looking communicated a complicated recognition that moved between them without becoming language. He looked at Claire last. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. "You want to tell me what happened?" She told him. She told him all of it, not just the room, not just the last 40 minutes, but the shape of the thing, the full architecture, because she'd learned from Petra that partial accounts get partial results, and she was done with partial. She talked for 20 while Caruso wrote in a notebook, with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who understood that what he was hearing had weight beyond this afternoon's incident report. When she finished, he looked at his notebook for a moment. Then he looked up. "The protective order that was filed 8 months ago," he said. "The one that disappeared." "Yes," she said. "I'm familiar with the situation," he said. She looked at him. "How familiar?" she said, a pause. "Familiar enough that some people in this department have been having conversations about it. For about 3 months," he said carefully. "Conversations that didn't have enough to move on." He looked at Preston's path out the door. "They might have enough now." She sat with that. The implication of it, that the vanished protective order had not entirely vanished from institutional memory, that somewhere in the Brookline or Boston system, there were people who had noticed and waited, carried a complicated relief. It meant she hadn't been as alone inside the machine as she'd believed. Assassin. It also meant the machine had let her get hurt while it gathered more information, which was a different kind of thing she'd have to feel later, when there was time. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Ronan drove her back to the penthouse. He drove himself, which she'd never seen him do. Usually Dev or Carver managed the vehicle. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road. And he didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, which she understood was not coldness, but the particular quiet of someone who was still processing the specific image of a room with a bullet hole in the wall and Claire in the center of it. "You threw the transducer," he said finally. "It was there," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not," he stopped. "I'm not criticizing." "I know," she said. He exhaled. "I should have been there," he said. "We made the decision together," she said. "I should have pushed harder to change the appointment," he said. "And I would have refused," she said. "Which I did. This morning." He was quiet again. "You threw a medical instrument at a man holding a gun," he said. "Not an accusation, not admiration. Just saying it, like someone placing a fact down carefully to examine it." "He was going to shoot," she said. The door was opening. He was turning toward the door. She looked at the window. If he'd shot Wade coming through that door. "Don't," Ronan said. She looked at him. His jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with composure. It was the face of someone holding something very tightly because the alternative was worse. "Don't finish that sentence," he said. She didn't. They drove the rest of the way in silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two peoples who had come through something together and were still taking inventory on the other side. The criminal complaint filing, the clinic attack, the weapon, the witness accounts, the surveillance footage from 3 clinic cameras that Theo pulled within 4 hours, all of it moved through Petra's office and into a prosecutorial context, with a speed that the previous weeks of careful, grinding legal preparation had made possible. The predicate was already built. Petra had been building it for weeks. What happened in that ultrasound room was the last brick placed by Preston himself, and it completed the structure in a way no attorney's brief could have engineered. Preston was charged that evening. Assault with a deadly weapon, criminal trespassing, violation of the terms of a civil harassment proceeding. And this one Caruso had pushed through with a specificity that told Claire those 3-month department conversations had been real and purposeful charges relating to the obstruction of a domestic abuse protective order. The last charge was thinner legally, Petra told her, but its existence in the public record changed the shape of the story permanently. The woman in Atlanta called 3 days later. Her name was Miriam, and she'd found Claire's public statement online 3 weeks prior and had been sitting with a phone in her hand, Petra told Claire, unable to dial. Preston's arrest had been the thing that finally moved her fingers. She had her own documentation. She had her own attorney in Georgia who got on a call with Petra, and what they built between them over the following 2 weeks was a pattern of conduct case that transformed a single incident in a Brookline clinic into something a prosecutor could stand up in front of a jury and call a way of operating. Claire and Miriam never spoke directly during the legal process. Petra managed the interface for liability and strategy reasons. But one morning a card arrived at Petra's office addressed to Claire, forwarded without the return address, and inside was a single line in handwriting she didn't recognize. "You made it easier to breathe." She kept it. The trial was set for 6 months out. Those 6 months were the strangest and most specifically difficult of Claire's life, which was saying something given the competition. She was pregnant and in legal proceedings and rebuilding a graphic design business and learning imperfectly and with significant setbacks how to occupy a space alongside Ronan Whitlock in a way that was its own thing and not a repetition of anything that had come before. They were not easy with each other. That was the truth of it, and she'd promised herself she'd remember the truth of things rather than the tidied version. Ronan had habits that had calcified over 40 years of being a particular kind of man in a particular kind of world, the tendency to manage information before sharing it, the difficulty with plans that he hadn't originated, the specific restlessness of a man who was used to being the most dangerous variable in any situation, and was learning that the particular situation required him to be something else. He was trying. She could see the trying. It looked like a large man navigating a space built for someone smaller, effortful, occasionally graceless, but genuinely directed. She had her own habits, the reflexive minimizing of her own needs, the tendency to monitor his mood and adjust her behavior accordingly, a pattern so ingrained that she sometimes caught herself doing it mid-sentence and had to stop and restart. The way apology arrived in her mouth before she'd assessed whether she'd done anything wrong. They argued twice in the first month. Real arguments, not the managed tensions of two people being careful around each other. The first one was about the penthouse, she told him. She needed her own space, separate from his, somewhere that was her decision entirely, and his first response had been to list the security reasons why that was complicated, and she'd told him that managing her living situation for her security reasons was still managing her living situation. And they'd looked at each other across that sentence for a long moment. He'd found her an apartment in the same building, 2 floors down with its own entrance from the elevator, and a door that was entirely hers. She moved into it 3 weeks later. She kept a key to the penthouse. He kept a key to hers. Neither of them discussed the arrangement formally. It simply was what it was. The second argument was worse and more important. It was about Ronan's businesses specifically, the ones that weren't entirely what they presented themselves as. She'd known in the abstract what his world contained. She'd known it the night she kissed him. But knowing in the abstract and living adjacent to the specific details were different experiences. And one evening, she came upstairs to find a conversation happening in his kitchen that stopped when she entered. And the stopping was the thing that put the argument in motion. "I need to understand what I'm raising a child near," she'd said. Not loudly, not in the broken register of someone frightened. In the flat, clear voice of a woman asking a question she required an actual answer to. He'd told her. Not everything she understood. Some things existed in categories that had their own legal weight, and that she was safer not possessing. But enough. Enough that she could map the territory. Enough that she could make an informed decision about whether she was standing in it or not. And then he'd told her something she hadn't expected. He was ending it. Not immediately. Not cleanly. These things didn't end cleanly, she would learn. They unwound gradually, contract by contract, relationship by relationship, over months and years. But the decision had been made. He'd made it, he told her. Somewhere in the 40 minutes he'd spent racing across Boston to a clinic in Brookline after his phone had lit up with Wade's message, and the making of it had not been complicated. Once the thing he was racing toward was concrete. "You can't do that for me," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I'm doing it for him." He meant the child. The one they hadn't met yet, who was making his presence known with increasing physical certainty. And for whatever chance there is at something that looks like a normal life. He paused. "Which I haven't had. Ever." She looked at him. "You want that?" she asked. "I don't know what it feels like," he said. "So I can't tell you I want it. I can tell you I want to find out." She sat with that for a long time. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay," he said. The trial began on a Tuesday in early November, with the Boston Harbor gray and choppy outside the courthouse windows. Claire had spent the weekend before it in the apartment 2 floors below the penthouse, going through everything she planned to say, not rehearsing it into performance, but rechecking it against the truth of her own memory, making sure she knew the difference between what she'd experienced and what she'd interpreted. Because Petra had told her the defense would work that seam hard. She testified on the 3rd day. She walked to the stand in a dark blue dress she'd bought with money from the restaurant branding project, the project she'd rebuilt from scratch on a borrowed laptop in a penthouse belonging to a man she'd kissed in desperation and come to know slowly and imperfectly and with difficulty. The dress was hers. The choice of it was hers. These were small things, and she noticed them anyway. Preston's lead attorney was a woman named Hargrove, who was technically excellent and personally without sentiment, which made her effective, and also meant she approached the cross-examination with a precision that had no cruelties in it, but left marks regardless. She asked about the recordings. Claire said yes, she'd made them, and yes, she understood Massachusetts wiretapping law, and yes, she'd done it anyway. She didn't apologize for it. She explained it: the emergency room, the pain medication, the vanished protective order, the specific quality of terror that makes a person act outside the boundaries they'd normally observe. Hargrove pushed. Claire held. She asked about Ronan. Claire answered everything. His name, his reputation, her understanding of what his world contained, the specific nature of their relationship. She answered it without hedging, because hedging was what people did when they were ashamed of something, and she had looked at every part of her decision to walk across that ballroom, and she was not ashamed. She asked about the night of the gala, about the kiss, about the choice to approach Ronan specifically. You selected Mr. Whitlock because his reputation would intimidate your boyfriend, Hargrove said. Yes, Claire said. You used him? I asked him for help, Claire said. He chose to give it. Those are different things. Hargrove moved on. She asked about the pregnancy. Claire answered. She asked whether Claire had informed Preston about the pregnancy, and Claire said no. And Hargrove began constructing the implication that this concealment demonstrated a pattern of manipulation, and Claire looked at her calmly across the courtroom. I didn't tell him because I was afraid of what he would do, Claire said. That fear turned out to be accurate. He came to the clinic with a weapon. A silence in the courtroom. Hargrove moved to her next question. The medical evidence came in through the ER physician, the same doctor who had written injury pattern inconsistent with reported mechanism in his clinical notes 8 months ago and had been willing to say so under oath. The photographs came in. The timestamps. The text message archive. Petra had spent 6 months building a structure that could hold the weight of a determined defense, and it held. Miriam's situation came in as pattern of conduct evidence. Her name was protected, her details anonymized, but the facts of what had happened to Hursts and the facts of what Preston's attorneys had arranged afterward were in the record. The recording of Caruso's testimony about the protective order investigation took 40 minutes. By Claire's assessment, the moment the jury's faces changed, Preston testified on the 6th day he was composed. He was precisely as composed as he always was in rooms where composition served him. He looked like what he'd always looked like, reasonable, articulate, slightly burdened by the whole proceedings, a man dealing with a situation he hadn't deserved with more grace than could be expected. His attorney had dressed him carefully. His posture was correct. He looked at Claire once from the stand, during a pause in his direct examination. She looked back. She thought about the parking garage at 11 at night, about the statement in the newspaper, about the card from Miriam that said, "You made it easier to breathe." She thought about the woman she'd been at the gala, borrowed dress, hidden bruises, wrist in his grip, looking across a room for Arnie, any variable that changed the math. She held his gaze until he looked away first. The jury was out for 2 days. She spent them in the apartment working. The nonprofit logo was complete. The tech startup pitch deck had expanded into a full brand identity project, and the woman who ran the startup, the one Claire had liked, whose name was Sandra, and who had read Claire's public statement and called Petra's office to say she'd like to continue working with Claire if Claire was willing, had referred 2 other clients. The design business was not large. It was not stable. But it was hers, built piece by piece on the laptop Wade had produced, rebuilt from the wreckage of what Preston had tried to make unreachable. She was 22 weeks pregnant, and the child moved sometimes in the mornings, and she'd started putting her hand there automatically, an unconscious acknowledgement of the presence of something that was becoming increasingly real and specific and its own. Ronan came down the evening of the first day the jury was out and found her at the dining table with the laptop and a half-eaten meal that had gone cold. He sat across from her. "How are you?" he said. She thought about it honestly. She'd promised herself she'd stop answering that question with the reflex response. "Scared," she said, "not of the verdict." She paused. "Of what I do with myself when this is over. Preston has been the organizing principle of my life for 2 years. Even running from him, even fighting him, he was the center of it. And when there's a verdict and the legal part ends," she looked at the harbor through the window. "I don't know what the next organizing principle is." He was quiet for a moment. He said. She looked at him. "You were an organizing principle before he was," Ronan said. "You had a studio you were building, a client list, things you were trying to make." He nodded toward the laptop. "You're already doing it. It's different now," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're better at it." She sat with that. "You don't know that," she said. "I've watched you work for 3 months," he said. "I know." She looked at him across the table, this man with the history she'd walked into, the empire he was slowly and imperfectly dismantling, the habits that had been built over 40 years, that he was trying to renegotiate at the same age. Most men stopped trying to renegotiate anything. He wasn't what she'd expected. He wasn't simple. He wasn't safe in the way safety was usually described. But he was honest with her in a way that had required her to be honest back, and that had turned out to be what she'd needed most from another person in longer than she could clearly remember. "Ronan," she said. "Yeah, I love you," she said. She said it plainly, without the scaffolding of a particular moment or a particular lead-in. Just put it on the table the way she put everything now, directly, without apology. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she'd. To read over 3 months the brief delay before his response surfaced through the composed exterior. The moment when the man who'd spent 40 years being unreadable let something through. "I know," he said. "Then I love you too." He said it like someone verifying a fact they'd known for a while and were finally acknowledging out loud. He paused. "That's not complicated for me to say. I want you to know that." She nodded. "It's not complicated for me either," she said. That surprised me. "Me too," he said. They sat there with it. The harbor moved outside the window. The food on her plate had gone completely cold. Somewhere in the building, the elevator moved between floors, with its usual soft machinery sound. "We should eat something," she said. "I'll make eggs," he said. "You always make eggs," she said. "They're the only thing I'm competent at," he said. She smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled genuinely, without any performance in it, in 3 weeks. The jury came back on the second afternoon. Guilty on assault with a deadly weapon. Guilty on criminal trespass. Guilty on the obstruction charge, though this one had been argued hard and the margin was narrow. Guilty on the domestic assault charge, which carried the weight of the ER physician's testimony, and the pattern evidence from Miriam's situation and the text messages, and the 12 months of careful, frightened documentation that Claire had kept, because she'd understood, somewhere in her bones, that the only thing that would ever protect her was her own evidence. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 11 years, with the possibility of parole after 7. His attorneys would appeal. Petra had said this from the start. Appeals were the next layer, and they would manage them as they came. But the verdict was real, and the sentence was real. And Preston Vardell, standing in a courtroom in a suit he'd chosen with his usual care, was going to be somewhere. Claire was not for a long time. She sat in the gallery and watched them take him out and felt something she'd been trying to predict for months and couldn't. Nothing, not relief, not triumph, not the cathartic rush of a thing completed. Just nothing. The way a room feels when furniture you've lived around for years is finally removed and you see the floor underneath it clearly for the first time. He was part of her past now, not gone from it, not erased. 2 years of it had happened and would always have happened, and she was not the same person who'd stood at Boston's Harbor in a borrowed dress, counting down 10 minutes she knew she couldn't survive. But he was past tense. He was over. And that was a different kind of thing than she'd expected it to be. Ronan found her on the courthouse steps afterward. He hadn't been in the gallery. Petra had advised against it, and he'd agreed, which had cost him something she knew. He was standing at the bottom of the steps with his hands in his coat pockets and the harbor wind doing what it did in November. And he looked at her face when she came down and read the answer in it before she said a word. She reached him. She took his hand. They stood there on the courthouse steps for a moment and didn't perform anything for anyone. "Okay," he said. "Yeah," she said. "What now?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about the apartment 2 floors below the penthouse that was hers. She thought about Sandra's referrals, and the logo projects, and the pitch deck, and the things she'd been thinking about for 3 weeks that she hadn't said aloud yet. "I want to start something," she said. "Not just the studio. Something bigger. For women who are where I was." She looked at the harbor. Women who are building an escape and have no money, and no business contacts, and no professional identity, because someone spent years removing those things. She turned to look at him. Something that gives them what Theo gave me when he recovered my files. What Petra gave me when she took 3 hours on a Saturday to listen to everything. What you gave me when you put a laptop on a table and didn't explain what it meant. He looked at her. "A foundation," he said. "Yes," she said. "That takes money," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you for it." "I know you're not," he said. "I'm offering it." She looked at him. "I want to do the fundraising myself," she said. "I want it to be mine. Your name can be on the donor list if you want. Not at the top." He almost smiled. "3rd from the top," he said. "5th," she said. "4th," he said. "Fine," she said. He took her hand again, and they walked toward the car, and the November wind came off the water, cold and specific and real. And she thought about the woman she'd been at that gala 14 months ago, counting down minutes she couldn't survive, looking across a room for any variable that changed the math. She'd found one. She was still changing. Everett Ronan Whitlock arrived on a Thursday morning in late February, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with a quality of insistent, vigorous objection to the entire experience that the delivery nurse described as a good sign since us, and that Ronan, standing at the head of the bed, with Claire's hand in both of his, Having spent 11 hours being approximately as useful as anyone is in that specific situation appeared to find both alarming and deeply, privately satisfying. They put the baby on Claire's chest, and she looked at him, and he stopped crying for exactly 1 second, as if confirming something, and then resumed at full volume. She laughed. It was involuntary, surprised out of her the specific laughter that happens when you're exhausted and flooded, and something is simultaneously overwhelming and absurd. She looked at Ronan over the baby's head. He was crying, not performing it, not managing it, just crying, with the particular helplessness of a man who has spent 40 years being the most controlled presence in any room and has just encountered something that made control beside the point. He reached out and touched the baby's fist. Everett's fingers opened and closed around one of his. Ronan made a sound that had no name in the vocabulary of the man he'd been before this moment. She watched him and thought, this is what the rest of it is for. Not the verdict, and not the foundation, and not the unwinding of a criminal empire, and not the 2 keys and the 2 floors, and the imperfect, honest, ungraceful thing they were building between them. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But this Ronan's finger in their son's grip, the look on his face, the sound in the room, this was what made the 14 months of it add up to something she could hold. She closed her eyes for a moment. She heard the baby. She heard Ronan speaking quietly, not to her, to Everett, in a voice so different from his usual voice that she didn't immediately recognize it as his. Softer, rougher. Something stripped of every layer except the essential one. Hey, he was saying. Hey, you're okay. You're okay. She opened her eyes. She looked at her son. She looked at the man holding him. She thought about the terrace, about the harbor, about the night years from now when Everett would be old enough to ask about the beginning, about how they became a family, about the gala, about the borrowed dress and the bruises, and the terrifying stranger across a ballroom, about the kiss she'd placed on a stranger's mouth in desperation, and what had come from it. She didn't know yet what she'd tell him. Not the whole truth, not for a long time. Children needed the truth in layers, age by age, until they were old enough to hold the full weight of it. But she knew the shape of it. She knew what she'd say at the center of it. I was out of options, and I walked toward the most dangerous thing in the room, and it turned out the danger was pointed somewhere else. And then I did the rest myself. The foundation opened its doors 11 months later, in a rented office space in the South End with 2 desks and a shared printer and a part-time coordinator named Diane, who had her own story and had found Claire's public statement the same way Miriam had on a phone screen, alone, in the middle of a night that felt like it wouldn't end. The first year they helped 19 women. Business registration, bank accounts, professional contacts, design work, marketing, whatever the specific gap was between where a woman stood and where she needed to get to build something that was hers. No press events, no gala fundraisers. Claire had a particular and permanent aversion to charity galas that she didn't think would ever fully resolve. Sandra, the startup founder, sat on the board. Petra did pro bono legal work for the foundation's clients. Wade, in retirement from his previous professional context, reviewed security situations which turned out to be more often than Claire had anticipated. Ronan's name was 4th on the donor list, as agreed. The shipping contracts, the restaurants, the legitimate development companies, these remained and grew. The other things unwound slowly, over the better part of 2 years, with complications she wasn't fully informed of, and that she'd made her peace with not being fully informed of. He'd told her the truth when she'd asked for it. He was doing the work. It wasn't clean, because these things never were, and she'd stopped needing it to be clean. One evening in the spring, when Everett was 14 months old, and newly confident on his feet and careening between the furniture of the penthouse apartment, they decided to make it the family space, her apartment below, converted to her home office and studio, a decision that had been practical and had also been the moment something shifted from temporary to permanent without either of them announcing it. Ronan came out to the terrace where Claire was standing. He stood beside her. The harbor was doing its evening thing. Amber light. The water going from blue to gray to the particular dark that preceded night. A container ship moving through the outer channel, enormous and patient. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "You're thinking about that night," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" she said. "You make the same face," he said. When you're looking at the harbor and thinking about the beginning, she looked back at the water. I used to think you saved me, she said. That night at the gala. I used to think that was the story. She paused. Woman in trouble, man with power, rescue. He said nothing. He'd learned when she was building towards something, and when she needed the space to build. You didn't save me, she said. You gave me a room and a locked door, and you made eggs. She almost smiled. I saved me. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. But you gave me somewhere safe to do it, she said. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not nothing. She heard Everett, inside a particular combination of sounds that communicated contentment, his specific vocabulary of babble and collision and laughter, at things adults couldn't identify as funny. She felt Ronan's hand find hers. She let it stay there. She looked at the harbor, the same water, the same channel markers, appearing one by one as the light went, the same container ships moving toward the open Atlantic with their cargo and their indifference to anything happening on land. She thought about the borrowed dress. She thought about Preston's fingers on her wrist. She thought about walking across a ballroom in heels that hurt with no plan and no script, and nothing except the absolute end of the road she'd been on, and the distant figure of a dangerous stranger who, turned out, was standing in a direction she could walk. She thought about Miriam's card. You made it easier to breathe. She thought about Diane at her desk in the South End. About the 19 women in the first year and the 31 in the second. About the spreadsheet she kept on her laptop with first names. Only the ones who had registered a business, opened a bank account, landed a first client, moved into a space that had a door that locked from the inside. She thought about Everett's fist around Ronan's finger in the delivery room. She thought about everything it had cost to get here, the cracked ribs and the vanished order, and the parking garage, and the clinic room, and the gun, and the transducer, and the testimony, and the months, and the work, and the daily, imperfect, unglamorous business of becoming the person you were always going to have to become on your own. None of it had been clean. None of it had resolved the way resolved. Things looked from the outside. She still had therapy appointments twice a week, and some nights the fear relocated itself to her dreams, and Preston's voice turned up sometimes in the specific quality of silence before a storm. She still caught herself monitoring Ronan's mood and had to remind herself, each time, that monitoring another person's mood for safety was a skill she no longer needed. She was still becoming. That was the honest version. Still mid-construction, still finding the edges of who she was when no one was managing her into a shape. But she knew where the door was, and it opened from the inside. Behind them, Everett's voice rose and then dissolved into laughter at something a toy, shadow, the specific hilarity of his own unsteady momentum across the floor, and the sound of it came through the open terrace door, like something the harbor had no equivalent for. Ronan squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. The city spread out below them, and the harbor moved, and the lights came on one by one across the water, and she stood in the life she had walked across a room to reach, in borrowed shoes that hurt, but the absolute refusal to go back. She was still standing. That had always been the whole of it.